Hello, and welcome to Collectability Podcast, the podcast about all things Patek Philippe. My name is Carlos Torres, and I will be your host for the duration of this season of conversations and interviews with personalities who have long ago been caught by the net of horology, fine watchmaking, and Patek Philippe in particular. Our inaugural guest in this season is also the person responsible for collectability itself, John Reardon. Although my obsession with horology is decades old, I only got to know him by name around a decade ago when I had the chance to write about a book he had published just a couple of years before. Patek Philippe in America, Marketing the World's Foremost Watch is a title that referred to the famous marketing slogan one can read in most advertisements published in the North American market through the 1960s. Through John's meticulous work and research, the book features Patek advertisements and documents spanning almost 130 years. Soon he started to materialize to me as a world-class expert with unquestionable gravitas, having served between 1997 and 2019 in two world-renowned auction houses. Separating his experience at Sotheby's and Christie's, he spent a decade in the sales and marketing team of the Henry Stern Watch Agency in New York. Having long been fascinated with the history of super complicated watches, I later found out that he had been part of Darren Schnipper's Sotheby's team that in 1999 sold the Patek Philippe Henry Graves super complication for the record amount of $11 million. 15 years later, in 2014, we ended up being both in the Geneva Beau Rivage hotel room when, again, the same watch made history and sold for $24 million and at the gavel of the then Sotheby's auctioneer Tim Bourne. From then on, and at least twice a year, during the spring and winter Geneva watch auction weeks, I was able to observe him performing on behalf of various collectors in his role as Christie's international head of watches. Later, our paths crossed again, this time in Florence, Italy, when, in 2018, the superlative Italian collector Sandro Frattini launched his book My Time, in close partnership with Christie's. As one of the largest watch collections in the world, the massive tome is filled with hundreds of incredible timepieces, mostly Patek Philippe and Rolex. 1 year later, in 2019, I watched as he embarked in his own adventure by launching Collectability, a project I would have never dreamed of collaborating with when he, a few months later, invited me to produce the podcast, of which this is the inaugural episode. What can I say more? One needs only to tour the Collectability website to understand that he is a man of great horological taste, an extremely knowledgeable individual, and utterly and profoundly bewitched by the fascinating world of Patek Philippe. So without further ado, I finally welcome our inaugural guest of this podcast series, none other than John Reardon himself. Hi, John. Welcome.
Hello, Carlos. Thank you very much. It is such a pleasure to kick off this Collectability podcast series with you as our host. And for those of you that don't know Carlos, he is a leading journalist based in Portugal. He is a horological researcher, very well known to insiders within the watch community. And most importantly, he's a gentleman, scholar, and friend. So it is a complete pleasure to be spending this time with you. And thank you so much for being part of the Collectability team.
Oh, John, thank you for that great introduction. So let me just go into the first question, John. We know you have succumbed to the magic of Patek Philippe long ago. But when and how did this all start?
Wow, my answer might be not the most exciting thing, but it's frankly due to eBay. In the late 1990s, I fell in love with Patek Philippe thanks to my employment at Sotheby's and being exposed to such incredible pieces. And I had a frustration that was quite common. I couldn't afford a Patek Philippe. So the next best thing I could do was start collecting advertisements from the company's early history. And I was addicted, admittedly. In these early years of eBay, it was quite easy to find and accumulate wonderful Patek Philippe ads from the 19th century all the way to current times. And I ended up accumulating over 1,000 pieces, and I still collect to this day. And that has really, I was thinking about it, has kicked off my obsession with Patek Philippe from reading their propaganda from their earliest days and assimilating it, comparing it, and understanding it. It's just sparked my my curiosity and helped build my knowledge with the watches themselves.
No, absolutely. I'm a fan of old ads myself because I think it brings something to the plus to the history of the brands, and that's very special. But however we look at it, Patek Philippe seems to be in a league of its own. What fine watchmaking is concerned, of course. The deeper one dives into its universe, the stronger the spell this watchmaker casts upon the collector or even the scholar. What is different here? What is so special that sets this maker apart, John?
From the advertisements, past and present, there are a number of things that you could see quite clearly, and then crossing over to the watches themselves, I see it in a number of different categories. First and foremost, is the history of this company is just this long march from the 1830s to today, when there's been a certain level of consistency and also a lot of change. There's been evolution, there's been revolution, and all the drama in between. And Patek Philippe encapsulates that. Next, clearly the technology, from Adrian Philippe's keyless winding system to the advanced research projects of recent years and everything in between. You see Patek Philippe at the forefront of technology, of all things horological. And that goes hand in hand with the art that we see with these watches, the craftsmanship, whether it's miniature enameling, whether engraving, jewel setting. All of these have been intertwined in the history of Patek Philippe from the earliest years. And that dovetails with the documentation. For those of you that have ordered an extract from the archive and can see essentially a copy of the birth certificate from Geneva of a watch that's been in your family for generations, that's simply magic. It's like getting a love letter from 1892 to your watch, and it tells you the day the watch was born, how it looked, when it was sold, and even the exact date of sale when that watch hit the marketplace. So my last comment is the community. For those of us in the watch community, like Carlos, everyone in the watch community from the journalistic world of Europe and beyond. For the collectors that are part of this family, to the watchmakers. In recent months, the past year, we've seen such an amazing rise of the community digitally, conversing in ways we've never seen before. And all of this makes Patek Philippe special in a way that no other brand encapsulates. And it's so much fun to be part of this community. We all have so much to learn together. And we're still at the beginning of this Patek Philippe. We'll call it a revolution. It's still changing extremely quickly, day by day.
Absolutely, but I have to say this: Patek Philippe stands out among other similar brands, if you can say, by the fact that they have been managed by a family for 4 generations now. And before that, of course, it was Mr. Patek and Mr. Philippe. And that really sets the brand apart in many ways. What would you say?
I think that's a brilliant point, and thank you for adding that. The independent ownership of this company is able to make it really stand above and beyond any potential peers. The Stern family, since the 1930s, has retained tight control and ownership of this company, and they're able to do things that others would think would be simply crazy. I mean, some of their watches, some of their launches, some of their projects, dating back to the 1930s, would have been impossible if it was a publicly held company. And to this day, we see the Sterns throw some surprises to us. Year after year, watch show after watch show, and it's really truly about family at the end of the day. And Patek Philippe has a unique advantage by being privately owned.
And it's one of the things we see on other brands. And forgive me for coming back to this issue, but there are brands who really you don't feel they follow their DNA. They are a little tied to the demands of the present market and how to sustain themselves with bigger sales and the partners they have and so on. It's not the case of Patek Philippe. So even the experimentation sometimes we see on Patek Philippe, it follows their roots. It's not something too much disruptive.
Yes, absolutely. Patek Philippe is not a company to chase trends. They are usually quite slow to jump on board trends. Even when seemingly every other watch company in the 1950s or the early 1950s had an automatic movement, Patek Philippe was one of the last major players to jump in with their 12600. But they did it in the best, most technically beautiful way. So even when they do catch up with the pack, they catch up in a way that is above and beyond and simply superlative in execution.
Exactly. So throughout the history of watch and clock collecting, not the history of watches, but the history of watch and clock collecting, the focus on a single maker started mostly with Abraham Louis Breguet, only at the beginning of the 20th century. But on the other hand, collecting Patek Philippe watches was a phenomenon that gained its true expression with the beginning of wristwatch collecting itself in the last quarter of the 20th century. Can you draw a picture of this reality today? Who are the Patek Philippe collectors of our day, and how and what do they collect?
Wow, the collectors of today are not J.P. Morgan. They're not Henry Graves. They're not JB Champion. It's a different collector, and this question really addresses or really challenges one to think about who the collectors are today and what category they fall in. And I've thought about this, and there are four broad categories that I consider collectors fall in today. And of course, there's often they overlap, and it's fun because I was thinking about some collectors I work with and see where they fall within each of these definitions of these four categories. And the first and one of the most exciting categories I would call the treasure hunter. The Patek Philippe treasure hunter is someone who constantly checks the internet, especially these days. They have their secret sites that they go to. They contact the dealers that they know, tiny auction houses that might exist and only have 5 people that seemingly buy from them. They go in better times. They'd go to flea markets. They would explore every nook and cranny to find the next best thing. And the collectors that I know as treasure hunters, they're often they're world travelers. They will go anywhere in search of the watch or the category that they're collecting. So the next category that I see the collecting community today is the speculator. In this, it's easy to judge people who buy purely for investment, especially today where we see people flipping 5711s. There's a lot of buying and selling going on for people who are specifically doing it with dollar signs in their mind. Um, yeah, as I said, it's easy to judge, but even different types of collectors, they all think that way too. They want to buy something of value. And even looking at Patek Philippe's advertisements from the early 20th century, they use the word investment in marketing their watches. So perhaps investing isn't a dirty word, but it is something that I have seen certain types of collectors a little obsessed with, especially in recent times when we're seeing values skyrocketing in many cases. The third type of collector that I see and define is the accumulator. Now, the accumulator is someone who literally hoards away Patek Philippe watches, and there are people out there and that have dozens of Patek Philippes, hundreds of Patek Philippes, and even a handful that have over 1,000. These people are often accumulators first and foremost. They're not sellers. They buy and they put these pieces away. And they're also the type of person who will always say, I've never sold a watch and I never will sell a watch. And historically, the accumulators are sometimes the most exciting watches when we do see come up at auction. When you see these treasure troves from the past um, uh, unleashed on the market. So kudos for the accumulators out there, because they are kind of putting together time capsules literally for the future. The last and final category that I would define collectors or as a collecting category is the researcher. Now we all know the researchers. I would accuse you, Carlos, of being the researcher. They are the type of person who just digs deeper and deeper, and they'll go down every rabbit hole to learn about an escapement or a particular retailer or a particular um, segment vertical in the Patek Philippe universe. The famous M. Stanga, the mysterious and famous M. Stanga from Italy, who has recently written a book on the Nautilus, original Nautilus 3700 line 1A. He is what I call a true researcher. He's not doing this for money. He's not doing this for anything except passion to understand everything he can about this particular reference. So, all in all, these four categories, the treasure hunter, the speculator, the accumulator, and the researcher, all of us have a little of each in us. And I really look at the collectability collector, we'll call them, is a little bit of all four. And some of us have more treasure hunter in us, some of us have more speculator. All of us have a bit of researcher, and frankly, all of us have a little accumulator in us too. So it's been fun to think about these four different categories and where we all fall.
Absolutely. Personally, and you said I'm a little bit of the researcher. It's very hard for me to understand and to look at a collector of a single brand, for example, be the collection vertical or horizontal, how they call it nowadays, and not see that he's collecting certain pieces and drawing a parallel line with the history of the brand. So one must be parallel to the other, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. At least for me. Do we have collectors out there that follow this kind of thinking?
Do you mean they will sit in one category only, or how do you mean it?
They look at the watches they collect also from the history point of view of the brand. What time it was produced, what is relevant on that watch, not only the outside aesthetics, shape of the case, the outstanding lugs we sometimes see, but also the movement. What is different? How has it evolved? Is it a timestamp of the brand or not? More in this kind of thinking.
Oh, I understand completely. There are collectors such as Roni Madvani that who's very popular on Instagram, who's obsessed with Gilbert Albert watches. He's a design-driven collector. He's one that also loves retailer signatures. So he's looking for automatic watches, in particular from the 40s and 50s, that have retailer signatures. There are some collectors who only collect 990 calibers in Markowski cases. There are some collectors who only collect one particular reference, and they need to have every single bit of one. But to your point, the historical collectors, ones that are really trying to recreate something from the past. I know one collector who has a retailer case display from Tiffany, and he's trying to recreate what a Tiffany in case display would look like in the 1950s. So I mean, that's a challenge, and you'll see how some collectors they go down these various rabbit holes it gives them joy in the treasure hunt to look at history and how it informs their collecting today.
And what about pocket watches?
pocket watches. My passion has always been pocket watches from the day I was collecting Elgins and Walthams and Hamiltons. In short, there is no better value and quality proposition today in the market than a Patek Philippe pocket watch. And I have a lot of respect for many independent watchmakers out there. And there are some extraordinary timepieces being made today. But take a watch that you can buy $5,000, even less, from Patek Philippe from the 1880s, 1890s, and compare the level of finish, the way the watch is made, the way the every single part is truly hand finished by a hand, not a CNC machine. You're able to see a level of watchmaking that boldly would say doesn't exist today. They might not be as accurate as what some of these masterworks being produced today, but they are certainly full of incredible personality. You could almost see the fingerprints, not literally, of the watchmaker on each individual timepiece. And for that reason, pocket watches, I think, are one of the most exciting things to collect in the market today. They are literally in your hand. You could kind of hold the mind of a genius in each of these little timepieces.
Exactly, and let's not forget that pocket watches had the lack of having at their time the régleur, the so-called régleur, tuning up the watch for observatory competitions. And we just have to look at the watches Henry Graves Jr. bought in terms of chronometer level, accuracy level. They were exceptional.
Yes, the observatory watch collectors, and they are out there. I think they really are focused on pure horology, and the story of the régleur and also the feminine, the régleuses that are out there is something that collectability will be digging deep in from a historical perspective, because people just they don't recognize that these individuals, it was just the human hand and a hairspring, and the capability of what they were able to do is incredible. And it's not computer driven. It's about human touch. It's about experience. It's about knowledge, dexterity, and the art of the régleur from the mid 20th century is a story that we look forward to diving deep within collectability.
And still focusing on the collector of our days, do you think we should criticize the collector who asks you what is the trend?
No, I think it's good to identify trends. Every phone call I receive asking for a 5711, I try not to judge. I always advise. I was like, would you consider something else, and why? I challenge people, like, why do you want a 5711? Is it because your neighbor has one? That's not a good reason to buy a watch. There are so many different alternatives within the Patek Philippe universe, and frankly, the horological universe, to buy. Chasing trends is not necessarily the most creative way to buy or to collect. And I've seen some other dealers out there today who are, I mean, literally they make a living off chasing trends, and they're hoarding particular references, and they're doing quite well. But if history has taught us everything, is trends change, and we're going to see. I don't want to call it a market correction, but we're going to see, reference by reference, some changes in demand, because supply is one thing, demand is another, and in a world driven by social media, demand can be changed upward or downward very, very quickly.
Absolutely. And regarding collecting watches, we all crave for that unknown piece that will come for auction, or that will someone will discover. Patek Philippe has a very good record in that term. There are a lot of pieces still to be discovered that are registered somewhere, that came up in history, were talked about, but we don't know where they are. So this is a very fun part also of collecting Patek Philippe.
It is. I have a list of 10 pieces in particular that I'm looking for, which I'm not going to share. there's some very obscure pieces out there that the world does not know about, and luckily, I know where some of them are. Sometimes families are not ready to let go of their heirlooms, and I can only respect that. And I always wondered, for those at Patek Philippe in Geneva, whether it's the archive department or in the service department, they are spoiled about the pieces that they see that are coming from the original families, and they keep their mouths shut. They are not sharing what pieces they have seen. Even from my 10 years at Patek Philippe, I saw some pieces that came from families that I'll never contact them. I'll never speak of them. These were pieces that they belong in the families. They'll stay in the families, and their secret is safe with Patek Philippe. But the Holy Grails are out there, and it's fun to know what's going to surface, or fun to speculate on what will surface next.
So the interesting part is that Patek Philippe has all these different aspects in terms of the kind of watches they come out with. We have pocket watches, we have, of course, the wristwatch, but then we also have clocks, which you've been very active in the last few months, showing us some great pieces on collectability. And also memorabilia. But the clocks are very interesting. Dome clocks, solar clocks. I think the collector can really get a kick out of these pieces also.
Yes, and I think I have to qualify myself as a accumulator of these timepieces. I'm sitting here looking at well over a dozen of these pieces. I can only think of two other collectors in the world that are equally obsessed with these solar desk timepieces. It's not exactly a common thing. I do imagine a day when many Patek Philippe collectors will, let's say, discover the pleasure of having a Patek Philippe solar clock sitting on their desk near a window, and the pleasure of turning one of these clocks around, opening often their massive cases, and seeing a pocket watch, a 17-line pocket watch, ticking away, that is wound daily by the power of light, is magical. And I just think that the market hasn't woken up for these timepieces yet. But I'm going to keep buying them, and even if I have an office and full of these timepieces, I'll be nothing but happy, and it'll probably be many years until the market wakes up to these. But in the meantime, it's a great time to buy.
Indeed. I think many people don't have the right idea about the intrinsic quality of these pieces, the weight, the way they are produced, the detail they have. Even though they are desk clocks and bigger pieces, the quality is still Patek Philippe level.
Absolutely. And today, speaking of dome clocks, they're all solid state quartz movements. So they're incredible timepieces in terms of their aesthetics, their enamel, especially the cloisonne enamel timepieces. But I have a special interest in the non-solid state circuit movements, the ones that use pocket watches, that are horizontally found within the movements. These are quite special. These are just undiscovered gems in the horological world today.
Today, John, your professional focus is set on managing collectability, away from your past as an auctioneer, actually. How has been this experience, and how would you set it apart from the experience I just referred you had in the auction world?
Wow, it's all about the learning curve. There are dealers out there that have been doing this for decades, that have much more experience in doing this. They're being close to New York City. There are some of the old time dealers that I have a lot of respect for, who have been doing this for 20, 30, 40, even in some cases over 50 years. I also have an equal respect for the auction houses. Wristwatch collecting at auction is really a relatively new category that's it's only say exploded and continued to grow since the late 1980s. But managing collectability has allowed me to reflect on my own values of what I would like to do for the collecting world, and I luckily don't have to answer to anyone anymore. And when I worked at auction, it was very clear that one was there to do one thing only, and to make profit for the auction house. It was all about market share. It was all about the bottom line, and that is how, unfortunately, a major auction house needs to work and perform. It's about money. Now, the shocking revelation is that the auction world, auction people that work at auction houses, they don't work for the buyer. They are legally obligated to work for the seller, and in many cases, the seller only. So you think you're entering into an auction, and you might have notions of what you're being told means one thing, but ultimately you're being sold to. Everything is about selling at the auction house, and it's their job and their due diligence to work for the seller. Now, collectability, obviously, I'm selling Patek Philippe watches, and there's no secret there. But there are two things that I try to think of it differently. I'm thinking that collectability is really, the vision of collectability is about education first. Is an educated consumer is always the best consumer. So whatever the content is, I hope that our listeners, our readers, our clients are learning something, and that's pleasurable, and it's good for the market. But ultimately, collectability works for the buyer. The bottom line is, I want the buyers from collectability that are engaging in business able to feel good, be knowledgeable, and understand everything about the watches that they purchase. So the major difference between my past life in auction and my new life with collectability is now I work for the buyer. Simple as that.
So it's also a kind of your relationship with your customer, with the buyer, is one where you give the knowledge, give the information, complement what they know about certain piece, advice in terms of what they maybe should come by next. So it's this multi-level relationship, would you say?
Yes, and I mean, there are other dealers, curators, fill in the word you'd like to use, that think the same way. We literally are on the phone 24/7 speaking with our friends and collectors, and truly, I would say 99% of them are dear friends. And this is what it's all about: is putting together collections of watches that I would want to have personally. And that's one of the fun things about doing what I'm doing now. It's putting together a multitude of collections of pieces that I would love to have. And I'm constantly taking pieces back in for trade. And there's always collectors that want the next best thing, so they might want to take one piece and move it for another. So it's this give and take, relationship driven experience. It really reminds me of growing up in Connecticut. We're a bunch of kids obsessed with collecting baseball cards, and after school we'd get together and we'd be trading baseball cards, and we'd be buying, we'd be selling, and it was just a great fun, a thing to do within a small, tight knit community. And now it's on a global scale, and there's many more zeros and involved, but it's the same idea. It's about community and knowing what you're doing, and having as much knowledge as possible.
So I would like to think that we have some seasoned collectors listening to us today, but also and probably people that collectors, watch lovers that would consider perhaps shifting towards a brand like Patek Philippe, and considering that some of them would like to start. How would you advise them in their first steps?
First and foremost, if you have a passion for another brand, uh, by all means, continue going down that road. I work with a number of collectors who are just as excited and obsessed about FP Journe or Reshep, Longa, Vacheron as they are with Patek Philippe, and that is absolutely fine. The amazing thing about collectability is I have the luxury and privilege of being focused on only one brand. So for those that are looking to cross over, I question people all day long. I ask a lot of questions to collectors thinking of buying their first Patek Philippe, and the first is why. I mean, what interests them, and the reason, or sorry, the answer that they give is the reason that they're even engaging with collectability, and it's easy to steer them the right direction where they might consider something that they've never thought about before. I was recently speaking with a client who just wanted to have a birth year watch from 1956. Simple as that. He just wanted a watch from 1956, and it ended up becoming a very long conversation about pocket watches that were made in the 50s, which are kind of pocket watch production was plummeting at that point, but Patek Philippe was still making pieces. And he ended up buying just a beautiful $8,000 time only from 1956, and that's something that's near and dear to him now, and hopefully will stay within his family. So you just never know why people collect. Sometimes it's emotional, sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's historical, as you brought up, and I really see collectability's vision as not only teaching but also listening and having these new dialogues that are very, very interesting.
So we know that you don't work with new watches or recently produced watches from Patek Philippe. So you focus on the vintage side, if you can say. Do we have a border when we consider these collectors between either they buy and collect the more recent and new pieces that come out to the market, or they focus on the vintage side of the brand, or in between, or both, if you can say?
Yeah, there's clearly the modern collectors, there's clearly the vintage collectors, and there's clearly those in between. I think the latter is most common. I think most people are buying from all different periods of time. I think that in terms of collectability being involved with current production pieces, it's not my market, and I'm not so interested in buying and selling pieces that are in current production. There's this incredible retailer base globally of Patek Philippe's trusted partners of people that they know inside out the watches that they're offering for sale, and they know the pipelines of what they're getting. And I really encourage people to work with a local retailer and build a very trusting relationship, because that relationship is sacred if you ever want to get the pieces that you're dreaming of. For the so-called modern vintage collectors, we'll call it pieces between 5 and 25 years old. This I've had this has been a primary focus unexpectedly. I've done a lot with 3970s and 3940s, for example. There's been a rise in interest in reference 5050s in recent months. So I'm looking at pieces that might not have had much attention that were made during this time period. And sure enough, they're going to be the next vintage watches. I mean, that's the one thing we all have going for us. We're all aging. We'll all be vintage someday if we aren't already.
That's the good part of because the newer watches will be vintage sometime. So
Yes.
The vintage collection is always growing. It's a never-ending story, and that is great. So, John, I think that there is so much still to know about the brands and hidden parts of history and the production of Patek Philippe we have discovered. I see the coming episodes of our podcast being very, very interesting. But I can't, I'm sworn to secrecy. I can't lift the veil of what's going to happen next. Would you be able to reveal anything to our audience?
We have lined up our guest for this inaugural season, thanks to your help, Carlos, and my colleague, Tanya Edwards. We are very excited to be announcing shortly some of these engaging, knowledgeable, and in many cases unpredictable guests that will be joining us on this first season of Collectability Podcast.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to it. And that's it. Thank you so much, John, for taking the time to speak to me and to our audience and to the world of Patek Philippe.
Thank you so much, Carlos.
So that's it. Thank you all for listening. And if you have enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe. And also remember following us on any podcast player you enjoy using in order not to miss our future recordings. Thank you very much for listening. This is Carlos Torres for Collectability.